Okay, in this week we're going to continue to talk about this concept of economic terms, and one of those that we talked about last week was an economic lesson on that markets work well. Well, just what is a market? So back into our concept, of course, of price. A market's really made up of something called demand and supply, and those two things come together and they create what's called a market. Now, this market can be looked at, and there's lots of ways to define it, but we're going to focus simply on the concept first of demand and first of supply. Once we get into these two concepts, then we can talk more about each one, but let's talk in general about the market and how that relates to consumers, which is really the focus of demand. So what is demand? Well, demand is someone's willingness to buy products or services, usually impacted by the concept of price and quantity. So just like you, the things that you demand and that you desire are really factors. They're based on factors, and one of those may be things like what makes you most happy? What about health preferences that exist? What about trends out there in the marketplace? What are others doing? That could be a factor of your demand. What about other products and services that you want? You might have to make choices, and so that can impact demand. The funds that you have available. These are some of the common factors of demand. Really, it is anything that influences you as a consumer. So consumer focus connects to this concept of demand. So all of these factors really relate to the concept of demand. And again, that is a very consumer-driven focus. So for example, things that you demand and you want, it really doesn't matter at all how good or how hard or easy production is. That's not really the factor. Your factors are things such as happiness, health, what are other people buying, and what funds do you have available, and what other products are you buying. These are the factors of what we call demand. Now, when we look at demand, and again, we're using price and quantity, so I'm going to draw out a little graph here between price and quantity. And we're going to be willing to say that when prices are extremely high, in other words, you'll demand maybe nothing of a quantity. But as prices decline, so you end up with this kind of relationship, you end up with this concept of demand. So I'll draw that with a D. So really what happens is that when you have something like a high price or you have low prices, that actually changes the way you would buy, because high prices, dictate and create what we call a low quantity. Whereas low prices, if I move across here, identify a much higher willingness to buy, even quantity-wise. So when you look at the concept of demand, which again, this represents demand, there is a couple things to consider. One, there is what we call an inverse relationship. So inverse relationship between price and quantity means that if price goes up, then quantity will likely go down. If price goes down, quantity will go up. So it seems pretty simple, however, there are other factors in the way. But this concept of demand means that consumers are willing to pay possibly awful high prices. Of course, they won't want as much, and they'd be also willing to pay very low prices, and you end up with different demand. So let's just say the market is here. So somewhere in the middle is where the market is, and we'll talk about how that comes about. But consumers then are having to pay this price, let's call that PX, and then of course they're willing to purchase this quantity X. So the factors of demand are easily related of price and quantity, and it really depends on anywhere along this line people might make a decision. Now, whenever you have an area that price is determined, this area is called consumer surplus. So if I kind of identify this area here, anywhere above the price line of the market and where consumers are actually able to pay, anything above that, they've just gotten the benefit, and so that is called consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is, again, this area in here, and it's this concept that consumers have been able to get benefited by the market. So consumer surpluses means they can move their money that they would have to maybe another product, or another product, I should say. But they can move it to another place. So they can take their exact amount of money that they were going to spend, and they can take it and move it to some other place in the market. So they're going to move it to some other market. So this is what we call consumer surplus. All right, now let's take a look at another concept. So let's move away from consumers and let's now start talking about this idea of supply. So what is supply? Well, supply is going to be producers' willingness, or I should say ability. So producers' willingness or ability to offer goods and services. So to offer these goods and services to consumers. So what are some factors that relate to supply? Well, a big one's going to be cost of production. So how much it costs to get a product out there is going to be a factor. The number of producers that are able to do this will have to do with supply. What are some other factors? Maybe substitutions or substitute products that exist out there in terms of production. And so do I have the availability of raw materials sometimes to get this done? That probably relates to cost a little bit. So numbers of production, probably seasons that exist. And so really with this idea of factors of supply, this is going to be any concept that impacts. Now this time it's not the consumer, it is the producer. So things about taste and preferences, what people want, what makes them happy, has of no concern to the supply market, a different situation. So what does it look like when we talk about the concept of supply? Well, we're going to use the same concepts of price and quantity, except this time the producers are willing to supply very little when prices are low, but as prices move up, you end up with this concept of supply. And so really a little bit of a different situation. When you've got a price that's low, you have a quantity that's low, of course. If you've got a price that's high, then you've got a quantity that's high as well. Now think about that. That's the opposite of what consumers saw. So in other words, the higher the prices move, the higher the quantity is willing to move. So what are some of the relationships? There is a positive relationship of price and quantity when it comes to supply, much different than before. And so we end up with this concept that if price is high, quantity production will be high. If price falls low, then fewer people are willing to supply in that market. So what we end up with is we end up with something that, again, we started with at the very beginning, is we end up with something called the market. So what is the market again? Well, I'm going to bring both of those graphs into one, and I'm going to say that the price and the quantity in the marketplace are going to be impacted by supply that is produced and quantity demanded that is willing to be bought. And just like we have, I should have actually up here in this market, let's just say in supply, let's say the market offers a price here as producers are willing to produce at lower prices. That's the price that is supplied, and that's the price, that's the quantity that will be supplied. And so what you end up with is you end up with this concept called producer surplus. So once again, we talked about it before with consumers. So consumers are sure willing to maybe pay more, but producers are sure willing to accept less. So anything above that is called producer surplus. And this is what allows producers to become innovative when they can create that surplus. Maybe that sometimes can be viewed as profit. It does depend on cost, which we'll talk a lot more about. But this concept of the market, supply and demand, come together, and when they do, they actually create that market that we've been talking about. So this is the actual price. What we call that is equilibrium. And this is the actual quantity that we call equilibrium. So really in this case, there are gains for both producers and consumers. When we look at this area here, remember this is going to be producer surplus. And so producers are actually going to be better off because consumers came in and were willing to pay a little bit more. Of course, that means that consumer surplus is here, and they were willing to pay more, but they didn't have to because the market came together and created this equilibrium. So this was this economic concept that we talked about last time, that this just works well. When consumers are able to measure their demand and willingness to pay, and when producers are able to measure their willingness to produce, these two come together and create what we call a market. So what we're going to do in this week is continue to talk about each one of these lines in a little bit more detail because they are, of course, more complicated. But this serves as a little bit of an introduction to what we call the market based on what we call, again, supply and demand.